Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week Lit 101 is moving from the Iliad to the Odyssey by Homer. This is book 2 of the epic cycle. I am going to be doing the Aeneid in the future, as well as the Metamorphoses. So we're going to move from Greek mythology into Roman mythology, but they are kind of all connected. But we're going to do 3 videos on the Odyssey. I'm really excited. This is one of my favorite epic poems of all time ever. And so let's get into it. So first I wanted to talk about the differences between the Iliad and the Odyssey. They are both attributed to Homer, but we're not 100% sure that Homer existed, because the Iliad and the Odyssey, they started out as an oral tradition. So it was, bards would go around and they would recite these poems from memory, having heard them from other people from memory, kind of thing. There is often a debate in academic circles about whether or not they were both written by the same person, because they would have been listened to from traveling bards all over and then sort of assembled into a cohesive written work. And this is a huge work. The Iliad is like 24 books, and each book is multiple pages, and it's a really, each one is like a long poem in its own right. So it's a little uncertain if these were for sure written by the same people. They are attributed to Homer, but it's more accurate to maybe say the Homeric poets, just because we aren't 100% sure. Moving on from there, looking at the differences between the two poems, there's some interesting stuff to be found here. First off, they are stylistically different. They focus on different things, they're organized differently. The Odyssey is sort of less formal than the Iliad. When you read the Iliad, it's very formulaic, and it also feels very heightened and almost stiff, but not really stiff. It's more like it's a very specific genre of kind of heroic poetry, and it uses long stretches of repetition quite a bit. There's sections where someone will tell someone instructions, and then when that person then relays what was told to them, it's word for word the same thing. And so there's long stretches of repetition. And when you're memorizing a long poem and it's only exists in your head, those long stretches of repetition are helpful because you have to memorize less stuff. But with the Odyssey, it doesn't quite feel that way. There are going to be repeated epithets. We see and then dawn arose fresh and rosy fingered, those kind of thing, the wine dark sea, that kind of stuff. But the Odyssey feels a little more relaxed, and the dialogue feels a little more natural. A lot of the dialogue it sort of replicates real speech more often than not. It still feels elevated, and it still feels kind of epic and heroic, but you'll have moments where a character is saying something and their train of thought sort of runs out and they change their mind mid sentence and they kind of go in a different direction. We see that with Nausicaa when she's talking to Odysseus when he first meets her. She starts talking about one thing and then kind of changes her mind, trails off, and starts talking about something else. Also, the Odyssey has more of a focus on day-to-day life, the home, and also the environment. There's long stretches of what the environment looks like, the birds, the plants, the weather, that kind of stuff. With the Iliad, it felt very much like we were inside everyone's heads. It was very brutal and naturalistic, and so there was lots of descriptions of the violence and the fighting and people's body language in the fight and everything, but we didn't get a big sense of specifically what the landscape looked like. It just kind of felt like they were fighting on this big open plain, and then at one point they were kind of closer to the water, and that was sort of it. There was 2 settings. And with the Odyssey, we get really lush, detailed descriptions of the environment. For example, early on we get a description of Calypso's island, and it's really magical, and the descriptions of the birds and the plants and the fragrance and everything, it really feels like there's lots of sensory details, and so we can picture it in our head. There's also an early scene where Odysseus leaves Calypso's island and is immediately sort of attacked by Poseidon. He calls up a storm, and we get just like detailed descriptions of like the water and the salt and his hands getting scraped on rocks, and when he washes up and he's sort of, he grabs plants to kind of cover himself, and we get a really good like sense of what the environment around him looks like. We can kind of feel everything. We can feel like the salt that's kind of encrusted all over him, and the sand and the sun and the trees. And so there's a lot more description of the environment in the Odyssey compared to the Iliad. Another interesting thing is that the way the gods behave is a little bit different. So in the Iliad, the gods are very sort of selfish, and they're focused mostly on who gave the best sacrifices to them. They are still sort of guardians of culture, and so they're kind of enforcing, proper deference to the gods, but they feel very much like they're not as concerned about justice. They're just concerned about who gave the most glory to the gods, and so if they did, then we're willing to maybe help them out a bit. And so they take offense a lot faster. Now, in the Odyssey, the gods are a little bit different. They feel much more like guardians of justice and right. And so when a god gets offended, for example, Poseidon has like major beef with Odysseus throughout the poem, it's because his crew did something genuinely bad. It wasn't just that they didn't give a proper sacrifice to him, it's that they caused harm to his children. We've got the Cyclops and the blinding of Polyphemus, which we'll run into much later. I'll talk about that later. But it's like the gods seek out retribution for generally evil acts, or like harmful, destructive acts kind of thing. And so they don't come across as selfish and petty as they did in the Iliad. Another thing that's a little bit different is the structure. So the Iliad, like I mentioned, is a very kind of free-flowing sort of story. There's not a really good sense of who the main protagonist is at all times. The main focus is Achilles, for sure. He is kind of the main character, and his involvement in the war, or lack of involvement for a lot of it, is what drives the plot forward. But we do also get large stretches where it seems like Ajax is sort of the main focus, or Diomedes is the main focus, or Odysseus is the main focus. It moves around and we get lots of different perspectives. In this one, there's very clear kind of protagonists. We do get sort of asides. For example, there's sections where we go to Mount Olympus and see what the gods are doing, but primarily the main protagonist is Odysseus. But even then, in the beginning, before we get a chance to meet Odysseus, we do focus on Telemachus, and he's very much the protagonist. Even though we have Penelope as well, she's a really important character to the story, but we get a few moments from her perspective, but it's very clear that like Telemachus is the protagonist of the first 4 books before we move over to Odysseus. So that's something that's also a little bit different. The Iliad felt more like we were moving from person to person throughout this really vast conflict, looking at people on both sides, whereas this one, it's more like, it's much more linear, even though it's told kind of in a circular fashion. And that takes me to my next point. This one is told in medias res, and so it starts out after Odysseus's voyage is primarily done. He's the only one left, his crew is all dead, and he's marooned on Calypso's island, and that's where we start. And so it switches to Telemachus. We get a sense of where things are, what the stakes are, and then after that, then we move back to Odysseus. He escapes from Calypso's island. He meets the Phaeacians. I don't know if I pronounced that right. And he tells them the story of his journey. So then we flash back to the voyage from Troy to Ithaca and everything that happened in between, and then it catches up to the present, and then we get the resolution from then on. So it kind of circles back to itself. Whereas the Iliad, it does start kind of in the middle of the Trojan War, but it doesn't do that kind of circular narrative. It just starts kind of near the end of the Trojan War, and then it carries on to the end of the conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon and all that. And that kind of covers like a few days to a few weeks kind of thing. And so it's a very straightforward kind of linear progression of the plot, even though the POVs are all over the place and we get a very big kind of grand epic story. So with these videos, I'm going to break up the Odyssey into 3 sections. For today, we're going to talk about the first 4 books, which is known as the Telemachy. The next video, which is actually going to be the week after next, we're going to be talking about the middle section, which is Odysseus's main voyage and everything that happened in that. That's where we get all the monsters and gods and villains and everything. And then for the final video, I'm going to be talking about the homecoming section, where he returns to Ithaca, the conflict with the suitors, and all that fun stuff. And this is one of my favorite epic poems ever, and so I'm really excited to get into this. So like last time, I also want to talk about different translations in case you're wondering what would be best to read, what fits best for you. A lot of the same translators that I'm going to talk about today are the same as when I talked about the different translations of the Iliad, because a lot of them, they do translations kind of in pairs. And so for the most part, it's going to be kind of similar, but you'll at least get to hear what the different translations of the Odyssey sound like, and maybe see, you know, which one you want to go and see if you can find from like the library or whatnot, if you want to read along, because the Odyssey is amazing. So for this go through, this is the one that I'm reading, and this is Peter Green's translation. It's fairly new, and I really like this so far. I'm at book 8. Yeah, I'm in book 8 right now, so I'm still fairly early on, but I really like his style. It's clear, it's crisp, and it flows really well. It has a really good bounce. He renders a lot of the kind of repeated epithets really well. And another thing that I really like about this translation is that he includes footnotes where he talks about like words in the original Greek that either don't translate well or which have ambiguous translations. And so he will mention, he's like, this is what this word kind of means, but it can also mean this, that, and that. And so it kind of gives you a sense of the complexity in translating the original Homeric Greek. And he also has a lot of scholarly moments where he talks about what people are doing and why, and explaining the culture behind some of the decisions. And so it's really interesting. It's much more kind of like scholarly and academic. And if you don't want any of the footnotes, there's some other translations here that don't include those, but I'm really enjoying reading this one so far. He's also done a translation of the Iliad, which I want to find because I want to read that. Another one is Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey. She was the first woman to translate the Odyssey, and this is a really fantastic one. Now, it's fairly modern. It uses lots of modern slang, but it flows really well. It has the short punchy lines, just like she did for the Iliad, and it works really well. This is a breezy read. It's a great introduction if you've never read the Odyssey before. This is a really good introductory version of the Odyssey because it gives you everything in the poem, but it's engaging, it's fun, it's easy to read, and it's just really enjoyable. So I would definitely recommend this one. Next up is Robert Fagel's translation. This is sort of the gold standard. This is one of my favorites. It's so good. It's a classic for a reason. It flows really well. It has a good mix of sort of modern-ish language, but also with that kind of heroic, epic feel. It's just a good, solid translation. If you've never read the Odyssey before, this is also a really good introduction to the Odyssey. Next up is Stephen Mitchell's translation. I really like this. Stephen Mitchell's translation has longer lines, and it flows really well. It's got lots of detail. I have some concerns with his translation of the Iliad, but not really any concerns with his Odyssey. His Odyssey is really good, and I would highly recommend this one as well. It flows really well, and it sounds great. Next up, we've got Richard Lattimore's Odyssey. This one is an older one. This was translated, I think, mid-century, mid-20th century, and so it feels a little more dense, a little more flowery. It's really good. Lattimore is a fantastic translator, and I really love his version of both the Iliad and the Odyssey because it has that kind of elevated Lord of the Rings style, and it can be a little dense at times, but it's very heroic, and it feels kind of ancient and important, and I really like it. Now the lines in this one are quite long. It can be a little dense, but there's lots of detail, and the way that he constructs his lines are really, really good. And then finally, we've got the prose version by W.H.D. Rouse. If you're not interested in kind of the poetic structure, then this is a really good one, because it's just like reading a novel. It takes you through everything. It has all of the information, so it's not like it's an edited, oh, there's a cat. It's not like it's an edited version or anything. It has everything that's in the original poem, but it's just presented in a way that's sort of easier to follow and read, and so it's just like a novel. So this is another good one. This would also be a really good audiobook as well. And so if you want to hear what these sound like, I'll read the first little bit of each one so you can get a sense of sort of how they work and all that stuff. So this is the prose version by Rouse. So this is the first part. This is the story of a man, one who was never at a loss. He had traveled far in the world after the sack of Troy, the virgin fortress. He saw many cities of men and learnt their mind. He endured many troubles and hardships in the struggle to save his own life and to bring back his men safe to their homes. He did his best, but he could not save his companions, for they perished by their own madness, because they killed and ate the cattle of Hyperion, the sun god, and the god took care that they should never see home again. There we go. And we got spoilers right away, which is good. So we've got everyone in his crew dies. Great. So next up is Lattimore. Tell me, Muse, of the man of many ways, who was driven far journeys after he had sacked Troy's sacred citadel. Many were they whose cities he saw, whose minds he learnt of, many the pains he suffered in his spirit on the wide sea, struggling for his own life and the homecoming of his companions. Even so, he could not save his companions, hard though he strove to. They were destroyed by their own wild recklessness, fools who devoured the oxen of Helios, the sun god, and he took away the day of their homecoming. So this is Lattimore, and I love the kind of epic, heroic flow of his poetry. Next up, we've got Stephen Mitchell's. Sing to me, Muse, of that endlessly cunning man who was blown off course to the ends of the earth in the years after he plundered Troy. He passed through the cities of many people and learned how they thought, and he suffered many bitter hardships upon the high seas as he tried to save his own life and bring his companions back to their home. But however bravely he struggled, he could not rescue them. Fools that they were, their own recklessness brought disaster upon them all. They slaughtered and ate the cattle of Helios, so the sun god destroyed them and blotted out their homecoming. I like the way he kind of constructs things. All right, and this is Robert Fagel's. Sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course, once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Many cities of men he saw and learned their minds, many pains he suffered, heartsick on the open sea, fighting to save his life and bring his comrades home. But he could not save them from disaster. Hard as he strove, the recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all, the blind fools. They devoured the cattle of the sun, and the sun god wiped from sight the day of their return. That's that one. Interestingly, he doesn't mention Helios by name. He just calls him the sun god. Next up is Emily Wilson's. Tell me about a complicated man, Muse. Tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered on the sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. He failed, and for their own mistakes they died. They ate the sun god's cattle, and the god kept them from home. I love this one. Again, a little bit less detail. We don't get, Helios by name, but it flows well, and it's got a really punchy rhythm that sort of is trying to capture the original flow of the Greek. All right, next up is Peter Green's. The man, Muse. Tell me about that resourceful man who wandered far and wide when he'd sacked Troy's sacred citadel. Many men's townships he saw and learned their ways of thinking, many the griefs he suffered at heart on the open sea, battling for his own life and his comrades' homecoming. Yet no way could he save his comrades, much though he longed to. It was through their own blind recklessness that they perished, the fools, for they slaughtered the cattle of Helios the sun god and ate them. For that he took from them the day of their returning. So this is probably one of my favorite translations. This one, Fagel's, and probably Lattimore are my favorite of the three, but they're all good. And there's other translations you can find. There's also Butler's translation, which is like in the public domain at this point, so you can get it for like free or cheap online. I think it's on the Gutenberg Project. You can also get a free translation of the Odyssey on theoi.com, so you don't have to like purchase a translation if you want to read along. There's plenty of ways you can get it for free. If you have an e-reader, there's plenty of translations of the Odyssey that are just like free or like $1. So, you know, don't spend a ton of money on reading every single translation. This is just, I collect these because it's my own ridiculous hyperfixation. So don't be like me. All right, so now let's get into the actual poem itself. And so for this first video, I'm going to talk about just the first 4 books. It's known as the Telemachy because it focuses on Telemachus specifically. And we're going to talk about sort of what the purpose of this aside is. So the purpose of this first section is that it introduces the stakes. It shows us what is at stake, what we can lose, who's in danger, why we need to know if Odysseus is coming back or not. We've got the suitors who are all clamoring for Penelope's hand. At this point, everyone assumes Odysseus is dead, and so they want her to marry one of them so that they can have access to Odysseus's wealth and power. And so the focus is on just the day-to-day life, basically, of what it's like living with these suitors who are just, they've basically moved into their house, and they're eating all their food and wine, and they're contributing nothing. They're just basically using up all of the wealth that they have just to keep them fed. Now, we do know that Penelope is able to stall them for a bit. She's able to use her cunning. She's very smart and is able to kind of hold them off, but she's been found out at this point, and so there's kind of no holding back. They're either going to marry her. Now, it's interesting. The suitors sort of blame all of this on Penelope. They say that like it's her job to choose one of them to marry. And so even though she's still holding out hope that her husband is alive and will come back, they say that like they have to eat them out of house and home. And if she would just choose a husband, then all this would be over. And so they're kind of laying all the blame on her. We also see how Telemachus sort of needs to mature and grow up, because at the beginning, we see him try to stand up to them, and we see him try to kind of call them out openly, but he's really insecure at this point. He's still quite young. He doesn't have the confidence of his father. He is described as wise Telemachus or sagacious Telemachus, so we do know that he has the capacity to be a very good ruler. If he has to take over for his father, we know that he has the potential, but he's not quite there yet. And we see Athena, who shows up, and she's sort of helping Telemachus along. Now, she's not doing anything for him. She's not going to fight this battle for him, but she sort of is able to build him up, to convince him that he needs to be the one to sort of make a stand here. Now, also at this point, we get Telemachus goes on a bit of a journey. He goes on kind of a mini voyage, and he meets with Nestor, who was in the Trojan War, and then Menelaus. And it's interesting because they both talk about the story of Orestes and Agamemnon. And so this is something that we'll kind of come back to throughout the poem, because the story of Clytemnestra and Aegisthus killing Agamemnon, and then Orestes killing Clytemnestra and Aegisthus to kind of avenge that, is a story that we'll hear told multiple times, and each time it's slightly different. The version that we hear early on is that Clytemnestra wasn't really involved. She was sort of pushed into this, and that it was Aegisthus who sort of usurped the throne from Agamemnon, and he's the one who orchestrated his death. Later on, we're going to hear a slightly different version of the story, but the main kind of reason why this story is so important is that Aegisthus is kind of like the suitors, and so he's someone who sort of moves in to Agamemnon's house, takes over his power and influence and rules, and it's up to Aegisthus, who's Clytemnestra's son, to kind of right the wrong of his taking over and avenge his father's death, and take over. And so we hear Telemachus getting told the story of basically, he's like, you need to be the one to do this. You need to stand up to the suitors. You need to take revenge for what they've done to you, and you need to either kill them or expel them, but it's up to you mostly. And so this brings up sort of the social contract of the whole thing, because you think about the suitors, why are they there for so long? What is going on? And so in the culture of ancient Greece, there was this hospitality culture. And so if anyone came to your house, regardless of who it was, you were supposed to make them feel welcome. You were supposed to give them anything that you had, food, shelter, wine, anything. And it was up to the visitor to sort of understand how not to overstep their bounds. So they wouldn't sort of become greedy and ask for too much. But regardless of what they asked for, it was up to the host to give them whatever they wanted. It was this social contract between host and guest, where the host would be willing to give everything to the point of bankrupting themselves to make sure the guest is comfortable, and it was up to the guest to sort of politely decline once they'd reached a certain point. And that was just how it was accepted. And so the suitors are taking advantage of Penelope and Telemachus's hospitality. They've moved in, they're taking anything they want, and everyone else in Ithaca is aware that what they're doing is wrong, and they know that they've overstayed their welcome, they're being too greedy, and so they've broken that social contract by being sort of freeloaders at this point. And so it is in Telemachus, it is in his right to stand up to them and expel them for being basically bad guests. But it's kind of gotten to the point where it's way past that, and they've committed basically a crime against Telemachus and Penelope's house. And since Odysseus isn't there, Telemachus feels like he can't enforce this properly. Now he can. There are enough able-bodied men in Ithaca that if he wanted to, he could raise them up and he could expel the suitors. But he's not quite there yet. He's not quite confident enough. At the beginning, when he sort of calls out the suitors, he goes and sort of picks up a scepter, which sort of gives him the right to sort of make a statement to kind of everyone. And he denounces the suitors and basically complains about what they're doing. And then he kind of he's feeling so helpless that he kind of bursts into tears. He throws the scepter down, and he just feels hopeless because he doesn't feel like he is able to stand up to the suitors. And he doesn't need to be, because he's stronger than he thinks he is. And Athena is there kind of helping him along. She's supporting him. She's doing what she can to sort of encourage him to make a stand and fight back against the suitors, because what they're doing is wrong. And so the stakes of the whole poem are basically just, is Telemachus going to be able to expel the suitors? And that brings up an interesting point. The whole middle section, the Odyssey part, is almost unnecessary. It is necessary because it's the ticking clock that's counting down, but basically the stakes are Telemachus needs to destroy the suitors, and we as the audience are unsure if Odysseus is going to get there in time. So the main stakes of the poem is Telemachus going to have to fight the suitors himself, or is Odysseus going to get back in time to help him? And so we don't know if he's going to get back in time. We do know that Telemachus has the ability, or he has the capacity to fight off the suitors, but is he genuinely strong enough and able to sort of follow through with that? And we also know that Penelope's plan to sort of stall the suitors has failed because one of her handmaids sort of snitched on her to one of the suitors, and so she's not able to kind of hold things off any longer. So basically, she has to make a decision because they're pressuring her into it, and it's getting to the point where they're becoming violent. And so it isn't just that she's being sort of oppressed with cultural norms, she's being oppressed with threats of physical violence to choose a husband, even though she doesn't want to. And so Telemachus is the one who has the ability to stop this, and he goes on a voyage to talk to Nestor and to Menelaus, And along the way, he sort of learns what it's like to be in command, to have people listening to him. He hears about the heroic deeds of what his father did during the war. He does get a bit of an update on where his father is. He learns that he's on Calypso's island. And so Telemachus is sort of, by the end of the Telemachy, he's gotten to the point where he knows where his father is. He knows it's probably up to him because he doesn't think his father's ever going to be able to come back. And so he returns back to Ithaca in order to expel the suitors. And at this, we get this really great cliffhanger because right at the end of book 4, the suitors sort of plot to kill him. And so they're saying, you know, they're gonna plan Telemachus's murder. And so once he gets back, they're gonna have an opportunity to strike. And that's when it cuts off and moves to Odysseus's point of view, which is so great because we're like, wait, what's happening to Telemachus? Is he gonna make it home? It's like those like 1950s serials where it's like, what's gonna happen to our, you know, intrepid hero kind of thing. And so the Telemachy is really important, even though there's no like Odysseying happen. We do still get some moments. I think Menelaus does tell a story about how he battles the old man of the sea, Proteus, the old man of the sea, and sort of wrestles him to get an answer about kind of what's happening to Odysseus and everything. And so there's like magic and things happening. We've got Athena who's in there, and there is like the sea voyage, but it's not really about the adventure of the sea voyage in this first section. It's about establishing who Telemachus is, what his character arc is going to be, what the stakes are, what is endangering them, and how important it is that Odysseus makes it home in time. And so the first 4 books are great. I really, really love the way that they focus on the home and the status quo, and then says, okay, now we're going to move to the actual hero of the story, and we're going to see, can he make it home in time in order to stop disaster from happening? And so that is kind of the first 4 books of the Odyssey. And so sometimes people feel that they're a little boring, that they're not exciting because there's not a lot of monsters and everything, but they are still really integral to the story, because the Telemachy and then the homecoming section are basically like the main drama of the story. That's sort of the main plot. It's the quest to take the house back from the suitors. And then the Odyssey section in the middle is sort of what's happening while Odysseus is away, what caused all this stuff to happen. We start off the poem knowing what happened. We know that all his men died and he's trapped on Calypso's island, but we don't know how he makes it home. And so we get to hear how he lost everyone, and then we get to hear how he's able to make it home. And then the story kind of picks up, and Odysseus and Telemachus are able to be reunited and deal with the suitors in the end. And that's what makes the ending so satisfying, because it's been put off for so long. The middle section is there to delay the gratification of that sort of final conflict, because you could have the poem jump right from the end of book 4 to the beginning of the homecoming section, and it would still make sense. It would just, we wouldn't get any of the voyaging on the sea, but we would have, Odysseus is finally back home, and now we can kind of get to work. But we do still need some moments in that middle section. It's not filler and it's not fluff. There is important stuff that happens there. There's Odysseus's personal journey. There's also some thematic elements that we'll see. It is still important that we have that, but it's this like really frustrating cliffhanger, because it ends book 4 with this moment of there's like plotting to kill him, and then we don't get the resolution for that for many, 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 many books. So the first 4 books are great, and I really enjoyed them. So with that said, I'm going to end it there. Next week, I'm going to be talking about my April wrap-up, so I won't be talking about the Odyssey then. The week after that, we'll be talking about the middle section. Week after that, we'll then be talking about the final section. And so if you need time to get caught up, to read, or just to refresh your memory with a summary, anything like that, do so, and I will see you in 2 weeks to continue talking about the Odyssey, and next week to talk about what books I read in April. So with that said, I'll let you go. I'll see you next week, and in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.